Hey there, my name's Porsha Lauri. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. And if you can't tell already, we are in full spooky season mode. Today's video is a little bit different than previous ones I've made. Usually I dive deep into one specific movie or TV show and kind of analyze it along with you guys. But today's video, I'm going to be talking about a trope that I see very commonly in horror movies that you might be aware of as well. And it's the idea of the final girl. This has been a topic that's kind of been on my mind for a while. I've always found a lot of strength from this character. I've always thought that it was a representation of female empowerment. And boy, was I wrong. But today I wanted to do a deep dive into this trope and kind of figure out whether it's supposed to be empowering or if it's actually quite the opposite of that. As always, if you enjoy listening to me talk about all things pop culture, movies, TV shows, music, what have you, do me a solid and drop a like on this video, then run over to that subscribe button, hit the bell next to it so you can be notified every time I upload. And once again, this video is gonna be a little bit different than previous ones I've done on my channel. So if you enjoy this format, if you enjoy doing deep dives into character analytics, make sure to let me know down in the comments below. Let me know what other tropes you would like me to further analyze, and maybe this will be a reoccurring series on my channel outside of just spooky season. So let's talk about the final girl. So the term final girl actually comes from a 1992 book by Carol J. Clover called Men, Women, and Chainsaws: Gender in Horror Film. Basically, this author looked at the golden age of horror, which would be the 1970s and most of the 80s, and kind of took a look deeper into this character type, which is described as the final girl. This is typically the character that ultimately survives whatever horrors are going on in the movie and lives to see another day. At least we hope so. Now, in Clover's book, she really dove deep into this character archetype to discover whether or not it was a pro-feminine movement or whether it was really something that came from something else. What Carol J. Clover really uncovered in her book is that most characters were written within the male gaze, and therefore these character types where we might see them as strong or empowered are actually heavy-handed male fantasies of what they think the perfect woman should be. I'll kind of give you my 2 cents about her opinion and my opinion about what a final girl is and what she represents kind of towards the end. But I wanted to kind of give you the overview of what a final girl is and what characteristics she shares that make her not necessarily a strong female representative. One of the basic premises of Clover's theory is that audience identification is unstable and fluid across gender lines, particularly in the case of the slasher film. During the final girl's confrontation with the killer, Clover argues she becomes masculinized through phallic appropriation by taking up a weapon such as a knife or chainsaw against the killer. The phenomenon of the male audience having to identify with a young female character in an ostensibly male-oriented genre, usually associated with sadistic voyeurism, raises interesting questions about the nature of slasher films and their relationship with feminism. Clover argues that for a film to be successful, it is necessary for a surviving character to be female because she must experience abject terror, and many viewers would reject a film that showed abject terror on the part of a male. The terror has a purpose in that the female, if she survives, is purged of undesirable characteristics such as relentless pursuit of personal pleasure. I'm not gonna lie, most of the time when I'm watching a movie or TV show, what have you, I really take it in for face value, at least at the first watch. It's usually not until later where I've had time to really overanalyze the characters and rewatch it to pick up small nuances I hadn't picked up before that I would start to notice these things. Reading some of the things that I've read about Carol J. Clover's opinion and other critics' opinion of horror movies and the final girl prototype has awoken that that overly analytical side of me, and now I can kind of see where there are issues within this trope, which we are going to dive into more. Now, in most final girl situations, she is considered to be of some type of higher class than those of her peers around her. Women who tend to be more overtly sexual or promiscuous or take part in illegal activities of any kind tend to be victims of the killer, whereas the more quiet, keep to herself, conservative female lead would be the final girl. So let's talk about some of the typical characteristics that are within the final girl prototype. Many of these characters have masculine or unisex names, like Sydney in Scream, which I'm going to talk about a lot more later on in the video, but that seems to be a constant presence, or they'll have a nickname that can be utilized for either sex in you know, the classic naming convention style. The final girl is usually classified as morally superior to that of her counterparts. So she usually is virginal or abstains from sexual activity. She does not take part in any kind of drugs or ambiguously bad behaviors such as smoking cigarettes or sneaking out of her house. And oftentimes one of the main plot points of these movies could be the fact that the main final girl is a virgin, and that could be play into the main plot of the movie in some way, shape, or form. The final girl also might share some type of unique history with the killer, i.e. like Halloween, where Laurie Strode is actually the sister of the killer. Oftentimes a final girl will lose focus as to whatever her original dreams or goals were at the start of the film. That means any kind of dreams she had, things she was working towards, become backburnered in favor of staying alive for obvious reasons. But this can also continue on. If the horror film becomes like a series, you'll notice that whatever the main character's passions were seem to dwindle quite a bit once they have this encounter. A final girl might also witness the majority of the kills leading up to their final encounter with the villain themselves. There tends to be more aspects of terrorization going on within the final girl leading up to the ultimate final showdown. So they may get phone calls or hints or messages from the killer prior to them actually being the sole target. Typically, in the end for these types of characters, they are either find a way to fend off the villain and or killer themselves until they can be appropriately saved by some type of male counterpart, whether that be a boyfriend, a brother, police officer, etc. Or in other times, they may never escape this killer and the killer lives to see another day. Usually this is kind of like a foreshadowing for future sequels to be made as well. And sometimes these final girls, although they may make it through and survive to see another day, they are often plagued with the memories of the terror they have just encountered and may have long-term debilitating mental health issues. An example of that would be like Clear Rivers at the end of Final Destination. When we come back to her character in Final Destination 2, we see that she has put herself into a mental health institute, probably from all of the paranoia that she's experienced after curbing death several times. So now that we've kind of gone over some of the characteristics that live within this archetype, let's talk about some of the examples that we have of classic final girls. Many people have coined that Sally Hardesty of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in the original is considered the catalyst to this trope. And as I mentioned earlier, Laurie Strode from the Halloween series, she is probably one of the most famous final girls, mostly for her continued appearance in all of the sequels up until this point. There's Nancy Thompson from the Nightmare on Elm Street series, and she's actually kind of a unique example of a final girl. A lot of critics would argue that she's actually kind of the antithesis of a final girl, as she is a more developed character than most. And finally, Sidney Prescott from the Scream series, which served to try to subvert this specific characteristic by calling it out on what it is.
What's the point? They're all the same. Some stupid killer stalking some big-breasted girl who can't act, who's always running up the stairs when she should be going out the front door. It's insulting.
Now, I would say that the cultural impact that happened with the realization of this prototype, as well as Carol J. Clover's book, I think served to show the fallacies within this specific trope that kind of forced like horror movie writers to try to write different versions of this character type so that it wouldn't feel so formulaic. I would say that in postmodern film, so like the 90s and on, we're seeing a lot more well-rounded characters with gritty backstories that don't necessarily just fall into a good or bad category. They could be kind of a little bit of both, giving the viewer a little bit more to digest, more information about the characters so that they can properly understand them on a level deeper than surface. Something I've noticed a lot too, and I'm sure you have as well, is that these women characters are starting to have strength that isn't just derived from the antagonist of the movie, but from something within. So some interesting examples of new final girls that we are seeing more oftentimes in horror films. There's Mallory from Bird Box, who is a strong and independent, soon-to-be expectant mother who has a lot of built-in fears around taking on this new role, while there's chaos of a world that is basically on fire around her. There's Teresa, or Tree, from Happy Death Day, who is pretty much the antithesis of a final girl. She does not meet many of her characteristic or qualities, and the film kind of serves to teach her a lesson in how to be a better person. There's Adelaide Wilson, who's from the beautiful movie Us, who serves dual purposes as being not only our final girl, but also kind of our villain. And finally, Amanda Young from the Saw series. And I wanted to include her because she does serve the purpose of being a final girl in 2 movies, but she actually becomes also a villain due to the fact that she begins working with or alongside the ultimate villain of Jigsaw. It's kind of rare that you see females being the villains in movies, and it's usually with some kind of giant turn where there's this perfect angel and then we find out that they're actually not so perfect, whereas Amanda has flaws from the jump, and it's kind of those flaws that lead her becoming a villain herself. So I picked like a handful of movies that I thought kind of subvert the final girl archetype and kind of show her in a different light that I thought was really interesting to pair alongside this classic idea of what a final girl is supposed to be. So keep in mind that the golden era of horror is considered to be the 70s and 80s. But within this popularity, the majority of audiences seeing these types of movies were men. With that being the main demographic that was coming to these movies, oftentimes the films were then made within the male gaze. Basically what I mean about the male gaze is that these films were made so that men would want to see them. I think the best example of that is to look at Jennifer's Body, and specifically the marketing around Jennifer's Body. So Jennifer's Body came out in 2009, and if you looked at the marketing for this movie, I don't think it is a fair representation of the movie that you would actually have seen in theaters. I felt like they were really exploiting Megan Fox and her body, for lack of a better term, and really try to utilize her sexuality, her attractiveness level in order to bring a male audience in to see this movie, whom at that time we were still thinking were the largest proponent of horror movie audiences. Now, if you actually spent the time to go and watch Jennifer's Body and you were thinking that you were gonna get a Megan Fox free show, I think you'd be sadly disappointed. What I personally found to be so interesting about Jennifer's Body is that it was a new take on the whole idea of demon possession. She gets comfortable with the situation that's given to her, and she kind of plays it out in a funny, on the surface kind of way, which I thought was a really interesting take on that kind of idea. I also didn't find it to be, like the movie as a whole, to be overtly sexual. Yes, she gets her strength from eating boys, like that's like the big tagline of the movie, but it's not done in a way that I think is grotesquely overdone. I think that the sensual side or flirtatious side is done extremely tastefully, and it leads into these really over-the-top, ridiculous death scenes. I also think that Jennifer's Body does an excellent job of showcasing just what Megan Fox is actually, like, her potential. Prior to me watching Jennifer's Body, the only really other interaction I had with her was watching her play Mean Girls or Hot Girls, i.e. Transformers. And so I kind of looked at her as a one-note actress because those were the roles that she was being given. Whereas Diablo Cody really made this film like its own. It felt like it was subverting the genre of horror in general by having two female leads. And the ultimate big storyline, or the moral of the story within this movie, I think was more about friendship and what that looks like in high school and the hierarchy differences. Basically what I'm saying is that all of the promotion for the film tried to entice men to see it because Megan Fox is just so hot. Whereas if you actually watch the movie, the movie's not about just Megan Fox being hot. It's about so many deeper things than that. And I'm glad it's having this sort of renaissance and finding a new audience. And it's kind of become like a cult classic within the genre.
The testing for the publicity and the marketing and all of that, what was that like? Because obviously something went in a very wrong direction, and where was that coming from?
Well, the test screenings were horrible.
Which were like frat boys?
Exactly. The studio had a very strong, unshakable belief that this movie needed to be marketed to young men.
Which came because of me, I'm assuming.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. I got a very memorable email where I had sent him this articulate defense of the film, and here's how it should be marketed. And I said, what specifically are you thinking? And he wrote back, Megan Fox hot. 3 words.
But I wanted to grab like a handful of final girl examples from postmodern horror, so post the 1992 book I've been talking about, to kind of showcase the differences between these characters versus where they were at in the 70s. Scream 4, everybody's favorite Scream sequel. Just kidding. It's nobody's favorite Scream sequel, I think, except for me. And it's solely because the big twist ending totally caught me off guard the first time I saw it. But in Scream 4, we follow Jill, Sydney's niece, who is going through a similar situation as to what Sydney did. What I thought was so interesting about Scream 4 is that the big twist ending is that Jill is actually in on the entire thing. And the entire ending, all of these killings, all these murders were leading up to her becoming the final girl. She knew that becoming the final girl meant infamy, and it gives you some sense of notoriety. We see that within the film, since it starts out showing how Sydney has written a book about all of the things that she's gone through, and she's now a best-selling author. And so Jill wants that same level of fame, and the only way she knows how to do it is through being the victim of some kind of tragedy. It's not a horror movie video on my channel unless I talk about my favorite horror movie, The Faculty. I feel like this movie is incredibly undervalued because it was so ahead of its time in many ways, in my opinion, and it also was somewhat of a remake without it being a direct sequel to anything that already exists, but it kind of created its own authenticism. I think that The Faculty tries to overturn this horror trope by refocusing it onto a different gender. We are almost immediately introduced to Casey, who serves the purpose of being our final boy or final guy. So Casey exhibits a lot of the traditional personality types of a final girl. He is shy, soft-spoken, but very smart and extremely resourceful. His inquisitive nature is what pushes the plot of the film forward. It also is what kind of ignites this whole Scooby gang that he has going on for the film. He also maintains some form of moral superiority as being someone who doesn't partake in dating or sex or drugs or any kind of ambiguously bad behavior for a teenager. He witnesses a majority of the deaths within the film. He is subjected to abject terror, as well as has to overcome his own personal flaws in order to be the kind of underdog hero. So I feel like when we're talking about final girl, we don't really talk about the male figures that sometimes fall into this category, but I also think it's very rare that we get to see vulnerable male characters within horror films. But that is something that I think is lacking in the horror movie department. I feel like male characters get to be in one of two categories. They get to be the nice guy that you hope gets the girl at the end, or dies, unfortunately, and he's the sympathetic death of the movie, or he's a complete jackass and everyone wants him to die, and his death scene tends to be one of the more brutal ones. So it's nice to see a character that doesn't really fall into either category. I mean, I guess Casey does fall into the nice guy that you hope gets the girl at the end, because he ultimately does. I wouldn't say that he's overtly nice, he's just kind of a typical guy, and it's something that I don't see a whole lot happening within horror movies. Because I was searching Final Girl so often, there is a movie called The Final Girls that kept floating into my search results. So I figured, you know what, it's on Hulu, I might as well give it a quick stream, and I watched it. And while I think this movie wanted to, again, kind of do the same thing as Scream, as kind of be almost a parody of a horror movie within a horror movie, I feel like it really failed in that term. We meet Max, who is the daughter of an actress who was in a very popular 80s slasher film, but at the beginning of the Final Girls movie, she's killed in a car accident. Fast forward a couple years, and Max is somehow thrown into a time warp with some of her peers, where she goes back to the original 80s movie that her mother was the star of, and she basically has to figure out how to survive it. And even though they're kind of talking about all these tropes over and over, you know, you even have your resident know-it-all horror movie character who keeps talking about the rules and what should and should happen, and is an expert at the particular movie that they've been dropped into. It doesn't do anything new or interesting within these character types. It literally tells you what the characters are gonna be, tells you how the movie's gonna go, and then the movie follows suit. So I feel like there was room to make more authentic decisions, to bring more originality to these types of character types, and they really just fed into it at the end. But I'm not mad that I watched it, because your girl Mia from Degrassi was in it, and so that was a fun time. I felt like I couldn't talk about horror movies unless I was going to spend a little bit of time talking about Jordan Peele and his masterpieces. I'm not going to be talking about Candyman, only for the fact that I haven't had a chance to watch it yet. But I wanted to talk about Get Out and Us, because they really flipped the script on what horror movie formulas should or should not look like. When we look at Get Out, we are first introduced to this couple, and we think this final girl, Rose. What we find out as the story progresses is that Rose is actually a villain. So she exhibits all of these characteristics of being a classic final girl, but then it's shown that she's actually quite the opposite of that. And so we have yet another final guy or boy, however you want to look at it, who is subjected to abject terror, who does show vulnerabilities and flaws within himself, such as him being a smoker. And it does serve a purpose as to kind of make you question some of these horror movie rules that we've been abiding by for so many years, to kind of show them in a different way that doesn't make them be like, okay, you are flawed, so therefore you're going to die. It just shows more humans and human nature, and kind of him being resourceful with the tools he has in order to escape. And I guess you could kind of say that he is ultimately saved by a male counterpart at the end, who from the jump of the movie had said, I think you should be wary of this girl and her family. Like I mentioned before, Us, Adelaide Wilson, is both arguably the protagonist as well as the antagonist for the film. I guess it's subjective how you take the ending of Us. It can kind of be scrutinized to be whatever you want it to be to some degree. I think the general consensus is that the film wraps with us understanding that Adelaide was actually from the underworld, the tunnels beneath us. And she was able to escape that by switching places with her on the surface human counterpart, and then teach herself how to be part of society and blend in. And then when she is confronted with all of this information, she has to figure out ways, be resourceful in order to stay where she's at. I also feel like the ending of Us is pretty ambiguous as to where it goes from here. So I'm really hoping that we're going to see sequels of this in the future. I felt like Get Out and Us both challenged me to look at horror differently. I feel like it really has subverted the genre to talk about more deeper society issues than just the on the surface childish ones, if you will. I think that most horror movies tend to be an allegory for something we are fearful about in real life. For example, It is the story of growing up. The way that those films are put together, where we have adolescents going through the big changes of kind of becoming adults, and then we have the second half of It, where it's people in their 30s who are also going through that big kind of like adult change that happens in your late 20s, early 30s. So I think that with Get Out and Us, he plays more into that allegory style of film where it's not just about graphic violence or nudity or whatever. It is about tackling these big picture issues that we are afraid to tackle in our real lives. So my final takeaways about researching into final girls and what they represent and whether or not they are empowering. The original or classic final girl prototype is riddled with male fantasy that has more to do with being subservient and silencing the exploration of feminine pleasure over female empowerment. But that's ultimately what I've really found in my research, is that even though some of this could be a stretch, I can understand if you're seeing this and being like, I don't believe any of that, I think it's just a movie. You're totally valid as well. But I also think that these are not traits that we need to glorify. They're just simply each individual's decision as to how they want to live their life. And whether or not you want to engage in premarital sex, whether or not you want to do drugs or smoke weed or whatever, should not be the definition of who you are as a human. And I think that that's kind of what Carol J. Clover was talking about in her book, is that these should not be qualifiers as to whether you deserve to live or die. Moving forward within the horror movie genre, this particular prototype, this trope, this character archetype to be, yes, less utilized and be more part of the paradigm of different types of horror that have existed over the years. I think it's totally fine and good to have a formula that you use for your movies. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think that the important thing is to bring something new or inventive to it, to subvert it in some kind of way, to not just talk about it and be like, ha, isn't this funny that this is something that's in all horror movies, and then do it. I think it's far more interesting to share these rules and then find ways to change them, find ways to surprise the audience, so that way every horror movie isn't just the same. And I think there's some new movies that are out. I know I mostly talked about things that I've personally watched and not necessarily a lot of new horror movies, but movies like It Follows or Midsummer or the Fear Street trilogy even really tried to show different aspects of these characters, gritty backstories, full-fledged, fully fleshed out characters. These archetypes can still be utilized in a way that's new and different if you apply them to people who don't necessarily look like they would be that stereotype. And that's pretty much where I'd like to see the final girl go next. So that's my opinion on the trope of the final girl. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to do me a solid and drop a like on it. Then head over to that subscribe button, hit the bell next to it, and then you'll be notified for all of my fun, spooky videos for the month of October. Let me know in the comments, what do you guys think about the final girl? Do you think that this is an overly articulated idea of this random character type that appears in some horror movies? Or do you think that she serves a purpose of trying to teach women what a proper woman should be like in society? That's pretty much all I have to say about that. I hope to be back here very soon for some more spooky fun, and I'll catch you guys next time. Bye!